donc nous allons passer à des réflexions de l'autre côté de l'Atlantique, en commençant par Andrew Wegmann. Alors Andrew est docteur de l'Université de Louisiane, assistant professor en histoire à la Delta State University, où il assure des enseignements portant sur la Première République américaine et sur le monde atlantique. Ses principaux thèmes de recherche et d'enseignement sont l'histoire afro-américaine, l'histoire des idées, le colonialisme mondial, la race et la liberté dans le monde atlantique. Il a publié dans différentes revues à visibilité internationale et il est l'auteur d'un livre à paraître, je vais surtout mentionner celui-là, Skin Color and Social Practice, The Problem of Race and Class in the Atlantic South, 1718 to 1865. Co-auteur de 2 manuels interactifs en histoire des États-Unis. Et il édite actuellement une collection d'essais avec Robert Englebert intitulée French Connections, Cultural Mobility in North America and the Atlantic World, avec la Louisiana State University Press. Donc on est très content de l'écouter cet après-midi. Je lui cède tout de suite la parole sur le thème, donc États-Unis, The Vitriolic Blood of Negro, le développement de l'identité raciale et de l'élitisme créole en Louisiane espagnole. Donc si j'ai bien compris, la communication se fera en anglais, mais Andrew comprend très bien le français, donc les questions peuvent être posées en anglais ou en français, voire en espagnol. C'est bien ça? Très bien.
D'accord, merci pour tout. Et bonjour Céline et Bertrand. It's been a while, both of you. Just a note, quand je dis américain, je veux dire États-Unis. Oui, d'accord. The introduction of concepts of whiteness, purity of blood, and legitimacy of kin under the Spanish caused a transformation within the New Orleans colored community. As generations of mixed-race men and women emerged from interracial families established during the late French period, Spanish social and legal practices permeated the New Orleans cultural landscapes. Suddenly, new ideas of racial science, mixture, and definition appeared in law, gradually affecting social intercourse. The ambiguous awareness of mulâtre et nègre under the French gave way to a regimented taxonomy of races and hybrid developed over more than a century in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Madrid. And importantly, this acute awareness of racial complexity and the social value it could have became a definitive feature of New Orleans' Creole community for decades to come, even as the once French and then Spanish city grew into an important American cultural and economic port. Importantly, this taxonomy and the Spanish laws supporting it never took a legally defined form in New Orleans or Louisiana, especially once they became part of the United States. But it did affect the social formation and racial identity of the growing colored community, especially at the top of the social totem. As Spanish laws gradually displaced French legal traditions, racial identities and designations became important concerns for colored men and women, including looking to marry, join the militia, baptize children, and serve as godparents, all functional claims to legitimacy and social belonging in Spanish America. Unlike the French, who haphazardly applied mulâtre, nègre, or esclave in censuses, marriage registers, and baptismal books, the Spanish separated the colored militia into Pardo and Moreno units, created 2 baptismal and marriage registers for whites and non-whites, and even corrected individual phenotypes in sacramental and legal records according to genealogical evidence later on. This increased awareness of phenotype, ancestry, and bloodlines amongst free inhabitants ran parallel with a sharp spike in slave importation. In 1782, for example, the Spanish colonial government, looking to bring in more profit to New Orleans and the rest of the colony, lifted its previous ban on the international slave trade in Louisiana. Presented with a hungry new market, French Caribbean traders from Martinique and Guadeloupe, who were experiencing a massive overflow of enslaved people from the Congo River area, introduced thousands of African-born bondmen into the largely creolized Louisiana slave population. In the 23 years between 1777 and 1800, Louisiana's slave population increased by more than 160% to just over 24,000 individuals. The introduction of lax manumission laws, as well as coartación, added to the flux, as some 1,921 dark-skinned Moreno slaves were emancipated in New Orleans under the Spanish. These Morenos, all designated by the Spanish, did not fit into the rest of the free population. Essentially exiled from the slave ranks by less expensive Africans, these semi-skilled, relatively young freedmen stood as a cultural and social threat, as it were, to light-skinned freeborn ranks of the city's emerging Creole community. Freeborn men and women had never been slaves, and neither had their parents. To associate socially and culturally, or even racially, with freedmen and women would be to accept a social and cultural and even cultural and racial position below that which they felt their bloodlines and genealogies deserved. So they shut themselves off. They married, did business, and engaged in social relationships with each other, only looking upward into white society for cultural and social influence and aid. They did not become white, they became Creole, neither white or black, Spanish nor French. This paper traces the development of this Creole cultural and racial identity from its ideological and structural origin in 16th century New Spain and its sistema de castas to its institutional manifestation in the segregated colored militias and Creole tradition that survived well into the 19th century. The word mulatto first appeared in Spanish America as a racial designation in a 1614 census of the Peruvian capital of Lima. In that year, 744, quote, people with Spanish and Negro parents, close quote, resided in the city. In 1648, the term appeared in a Mexican census to describe people, quote, of a mixed nature of Spaniards and blackamoors. To that point, Spanish colonial law had only differentiated between people of pure European blood, españoles, and those of mixed European and indigenous blood, usually called castas. Within this sistema de casta, which differed slightly from colony to colony, españoles stood alone atop the hierarchy, while the castas, subcastes called calidades, or usually called calidades, progressively based on the percentage of European blood in a given category's ancestry. In both the Lima and Mexico censuses, as well as a number of others from Guatemala and Argentina, the data for mulattoes were physically separated from those of Spaniards, castizos, mestizos, and indios. This suggests that colonial administrators were not exactly sure where people of mixed Spanish and African blood fell in the colonial system. In their veins ran the blood of the fundamentally free and the blood of the fundamentally unfree. They were, in the eyes of colonial officials and castas, a truly, quote, exotic breed, maintaining no connection to the land and, quote, impure and illegitimate connection to Spanish society. They were, it seemed, secondary, unnatural, and misplaced. The growth of the mulatto population in Central America forced Spanish officials to take note of skin color for the first time, at least in any official capacity. Although skin tone never defined one's calidad, the Spanish did see skin color as an external indicator of what they called internal corruption, much like the French did in the 18th century. To Spanish eyes, indios, mestizos, and castizos were darker than españoles. Officials just never actually defined exactly how much darker each one was than the next. But mulattoes were different. Spanish colonial governors, thinkers, and even the Spanish crown did not know what to do with this growing population of Indio-colored, half Spanish, half African freedmen. In 1693, Manuel de Faria y Sousa a Spanish cleric and legislator in Madrid wrote that, quote, the blood of the mulatto represents the meeting of opposing objects, freedom and enslavement. The name mulatto, he continued, quote, likewise comes from the mule, a name derived from two others of different species, born to work and never to create itself. The Spanish did not think Africans or mulattoes different species of mankind, though, as a number of pseudoscientists in the future antebellum American South would come to reason in the 1830s and 1840s under an idea called ethnology. They simply viewed mulattoes as the closest human example to a, quote, mule-like hybrid. The word did, in fact, combine the Spanish root mulo, meaning mule, and the suffix ito, meaning derived from or youth of. African blood to early Spanish scientists like Benito Feijoo, for example, was what he called vitriolic. It, quote, corrupted and destroyed and overcame whatever bile and matter it contacted. Echoing the early climatists coming out of the European Enlightenment in the early 1700s, Feijoo asserted that the, quote, brutal air and soil of Africa caused the, quote, acidity of the blood to increase and damage the internal organs, quote, burning the skin. It is upon this foundation that the Spanish crown and colonial legislators built a new sistema de castas. Using this early Enlightenment philosophy and, quote, science, King Philip V implemented a new sistema de castas between 1702 and 1723. This new system established a separate, extremely complex branch of calidades for people of African descent. This time, one's calidad referred mainly to his or her skin tone and blood composition, although economic and cultural factors, of course, as well as reputation, did maintain some influence. For people of African descent, the new casta system was cyclical because the system was based upon the internal and external features of blood and skin color. Officials were able to include the entire African descended population, whatever their specific colors or ancestors. The logic behind the endless hierarchy came from the new scientific discoveries, as it were, in Spain. According to Pedro Alonso O'Crowley, an Irish-born Spanish physician, quote, the mulatto can never leave his condition of mixed blood because, quote, it is the Spanish element that is lost and absorbed into the condition of the Negro. Using Feijoo's original wording, O'Crowley explained, quote, that, quote, the vitriolic blood of the Negro corrupts and the unexposed blood of the pure Spaniard. The system was, in essence, the first legally codified hypodescendant racial order in American history. No matter what the level of admixture, African blood trumped all. Introduced first in Mexico in 1702 and then throughout the entire Spanish-American Empire a decade later, the new casta system looked to lump people of African descent together at the bottom of the social and racial order. The aim of this universal subjugation was the creation of a subaltern identity among the gente de color and what Joanne Publitt has called an intracolonial colonialism. The new system categorized the gente de color first according to color and then according to the levels of African blood. If the law only recognized African blood and the pigmentation it caused, the gente de color could not claim relation to, affiliation with, or even legal representation as Spaniards or even colonists. They were tied to their African lineages. The terms pardo and moreno designated the two color categories within the system and moved upward or downward depending on ancestry and appearance. When the casta system arrived in New Orleans with the Spanish, it meant a society unused to a structured racial order. Although the terms nègre, mulâtre, and even quarteron existed in the Franco-Louisiana lexicon, they hardly maintained definitive meanings. The term mulâtre, generally speaking, served a similar purpose to the Spanish term pardo. Both described ambiguously mixed-race people, almost universally free and lighter in color than nègres or morenos, who were assumed darker and unmixed. The haphazard racial structure of French Louisiana contained no standard qualités beneath mulâtre and nègre. Instead, officials simply attached the designation libre to separate the free from the enslaved. Society itself did believe most mulâtres free and most nègres enslaved, but there was no official status attached to either designation. Thus, when the arrival of the Spanish came, with the arrival of the Spanish came an entirely new concept of racial definition, and race suddenly became important, definable characteristic in the social order. New Orleans was the first newly acquired Spanish colony to experience the conquest. Introduced in the Spanish American Empire outside of Mexico in 1712, the system became law only in colonies that already existed within the Spanish colonial empire at the time. None of these colonies, or very few, quite obviously, had belonged to another European power for any meaningful period of time. But New Orleans was different. Its people spoke French, and many of them saw the French metropolis of Paris as their original and ancestral home. French law and culture still pervaded, and the French-based Atlantic notions of race defined the order of society. It was not until 1763 that mulâtre, for example, numbered more than 10 individuals in the census, and that year marked only the second time the term was ever used in an official enumeration. Introducing a highly structured system of socio-racial categorization, then, would not be easy for the Spanish. The Spanish crown did not force this new system on the Francophone people of Louisiana, though. Instead, it wisely, under the leadership of Governor Alejandro O'Reilly, another Irish-born leader, merged the sistema with Louisiana's decades-old Code Noir of 1724. By maintaining many of the major regulations and privileges found in the Code Noir, Spanish officials could justify certain new restrictions and rights to the skeptical new Spanish subject. O'Reilly's code, as the 1769 laws came to be known, shifted the weight of the system more toward race and color than status and freedom. And perhaps most important, it introduced a new racial language to Louisiana, one taken directly from the castas, or from the Sistema de Castas. Suddenly, phenotype and perceived ancestry became fundamental to an individual's social and corporate identities. Beginning in 1771, Cuarterón, mulattos, grifos, and even a tirceron started to appear in baptismal and marriage registers, as well as all forms of official documentation, where mulâtre once stood as the socially and racially ambiguous buffers between white freedom and black enslavement under the French. A varied group of former slaves and freeborn Frenchmen spanned the racial spectrum under the Spanish. A true, quote, colored community was forming. 5 years later, a Real Pragmática from Madrid required priests in quote, all urban colonies to record the marriages and baptisms of whites and people of color in separate registers. In New Orleans, these books took the form of libros de blancos and libros de gente de color. Blood purity was clearly not the issue. With a book for whites and a book for people of color, phenotype, or one's degree of color, was the obvious centerpiece in the new colony. Born between 1760 and 1780, born between 1760 and 1780, the first generation of freeborn Spanish Orleanians came of age at a pivotal moment in the racial history of the city. As O'Reilly's Code and the Real Pragmática essentially finalized, the implementation of the new casta system in New Orleans, the colored community began to divide along demographic lines. It is here that the new racial language introduced by O'Reilly provides an insight into the social workings of the colored community. By looking at the specific phenotypes attributed to slaves freed during the Spanish period, in combination with marriage records and baptisms, we can start to see a color line or color lines develop within the free colored population, separating the light from the dark or the illegitimate from the legitimate. As mentioned at the beginning of the paper, coartación and lax manumission laws muddled the line between freedom and enslavement in the 1770s and 1780s. In all, 1,921 slaves received their freedom during the Spanish era. Together with those who were born free, they made up a free colored population of just over 3,100 or 3,100 in New Orleans by 1800. During the Spanish period, then, a large impoverished dark skin or darker phenotype contingent of former slaves joined the ranks of the largely skilled, light-skinned, freeborn people. The latter did not welcome the former into their community, though. In fact, they moved away from the primarily dark-skinned former slaves and slowly created a community for themselves and those like them. Spanish law and surviving French social customs already created simple divides within the free community based on skin color, ancestry, skill, and status, whether one was freeborn or freed. But as the number of manumitted morenos and newly imported African slaves increased over the Spanish period, these once immature subconscious social attributes became conscious markers of class, culture, and race. The contrast between men like Jean-Louis Doyol, a wealthy, socially active, literate, professional carteron, and Silvestre, an illiterate Moreno carpenter who purchased his freedom through coartación in 1784 for 300 pesos, for example, drove an emerging self-conscious elite away from what they called a, quote, growing black mass. Over the first 2 decades of Spanish rule, Pardos and other light-skinned freemen started to adopt the social characteristics celebrated within white society. Did not recognize colored legitimacy. Marriage was all but universal in the upper echelon of the social-racial hierarchy. By the time the second generation of freeborn Orleanians came of age at the end of the Spanish period. Debarred by law from the trappings of whiteness, socially prominent free people of color looked to create their own sense of elitism, their own sense of social and cultural markers, their own set of social and cultural markers identifying, quote, the legitimacy and illegitimacy of others. Though numerically few and socially disconnected from most of the French period, these emerging mixed-race elite families that developed out of interracial partnerships during the 1770s and 1780s shared certain traits that naturally brought them together. Francophone and Catholic, debarred from the professional realms, illegitimate by birth and law, these young freeborn Orleanians with white surnames and brown skin found themselves growing both physically and culturally alongside each other. A cultural endogamy thus developed around the social and racial ambiguity that had kept their parents separate and culturally undefined under the French. In the face of an expanding population of darker-skinned freedmen and women, they found definition and structure in their light color, free birth, mixed ancestry, and their white surnames. They created an identity with the tools given them by their parents and the casta system. Their to them became a point of pride. On a number of occasions, colored men and women asked parish priests or colonial officials to change or correct the phenotypes given them in sacramental records. At baptism, priests usually recorded the racial designations based on observation alone, especially when the father was recorded as, quote, unknown, and genealogical evidence was unavailable. These records thus stood as representations of how individuals appeared to an informed third party, rather than reflections of their actual racial backgrounds. Under Spanish law in New Orleans, baptismal records specifically served as official colonial records. Men and women of color legally took the designation given them in sacramental records, regardless of their reputations in society. As a result, the baptismal registers of the Spanish period in New Orleans are dotted with alterations and changes to individuals' phenotypes. On July 20th, 1777, as one of dozens of examples shows, Marie Adelaide Cheval was baptized as a quote, mulâtresse in St. Louis Church, which is now St. Louis Cathedral. At some point over the next 26 years, a priest went back to that entry, scratched out the French mulâtresse, and wrote the Spanish cuarterón above it. In all likelihood, a second priest changed the record years later, probably at the behest of Marie herself, but who knows, right? Who was, in fact, as other records show, the quadroon daughter of a free mulâtresse and a white man. Although Spanish law maintained no legal difference between a mulatto and a cuarterón, it clearly meant something to the increasingly self-isolated, free-born population in New Orleans and Louisiana. By correcting specific phenotypes in sacramental registers, these socially and racially ambiguous people created official records of their family's racial history. They provided proof of one's bloodline and pedigree, serving as another indicator of elite status and upbringing, regardless of wealth, education, and other European standards of class and refinement. They literally created their own archive. And that most of the changes appeared on the records of women, and every one of them provided a step up in the racial hierarchy, suggests that these alterations were intended for some internal process of racial and family development. Perhaps more importantly, these freeborn Orleanians started marrying each other, consciously creating new families with beneficial social and racial, quote, attributes, as one of them many years later. In forging a new web of legitimacy, and Creoles of color kept a keen eye on skin color. Not once, for example, in all the marriages that occurred within the freeborn colored community in the city, did phenotypes differ between parties more than one generation of African blood. And more than 75% of the time, both partners shared the same racial and phenotypic designation. The colored militia followed this same pattern. Resurrected by Alejandro O'Reilly in the late 1770s, when Spain joined France in their support of the American colonists against the British, the colored militia split into two regiments based entirely upon skin color, one for pardos and one for morenos. And although men like Noel Carrière, the captain of the Moreno regiment, stood as witness for many pardo wedding ceremonies, more than a dozen of which involved members of the lighter-skinned regiment, the emerging interracial color line, codified in part by the endogamous marriage practices amongst Creoles of color, did not go away when one of the partners donned a militia uniform. In fact, it simply got stronger and more defined. In every case, regardless of who stood as a witness, the militiaman married a woman of the exact same registered phenotype or calidad, much less the same casta. Perhaps more to the point, though, in the 1795 census of New Orleans, François d'Orville, the captain of the Pardo regiment and a well-known member of the emerging Creole elite, made clear where he stood in society. The only member of the militia to mention his service in the entire document, d'Orville, in the space provided for profession, wrote capitaine des mulâtres et quarterons libres. Instead of using the official accepted term for his regiment, milicias de pardos, he used the French versions of the two specific phenotypes classified as pardo in the casta system. He never actually mentioned the militia at all. By choosing French over Spanish and dropping the generic term pardo, D'Urville made clear the emergence of an as yet unnamed Creole identity. He referred back to the racial ambiguity and status identification of the late French period, but showed how the inklings of a cultural and social identity back then had found definition and classification under the Spanish. He could have phrased his 6-word history of his people differently, but the final product painted an honest picture. They were not simply pardos, and neither were they all militiamen. They were Francophone Creoles of Spanish Louisiana, privileged by the white blood that ran in their veins. A Creole community thus formed on a fast-changing social and political landscape. If anything, D'Urville's response was more a reflection of where he, Jean-Louis Doyol, and other mulâtres et Catalans libres were headed than whence they were coming. The casta system that arrived with the Spanish gave these men, their families, their children, and their grandchildren, well into the 19th century, a language of race and degree, a social order all their own upon which to build the identity that would at once propel them forward and hold them back as Louisiana became an American territory and then one of the United States. By ascribing meaning to each level of the system, freeborn Orleanians were able to forge a social hierarchy independent of status, yet perfectly in line with the expectations of the white community of both the Spanish colonial world and the young American Republic. They never claimed a position in the white system. They simply used the tools given them by the casta system to differentiate themselves from what they called the lower orders of colored people, the morenos and freedmen. And by marrying each other, they created physical and nominal legacies for themselves and their kin. They preserved the social order in blood, sure that certain families remained light-skinned French and now, more than ever, Creole. This could not have occurred without the casta system and Spain's experiences in Central and South America centuries earlier. But it also took form in the hands of a self-conscious community in need of cultural and racial definition. Under the Spanish, they rebuilt one and found the other. Merci beaucoup.